This week on The Right Side, Alberta halts BC wine imports in response to Trans Mountain stalling, the BC Liberals elected Andrew Wilkinson as leader, the NEB could be replaced by the federal government to streamline energy assessments, and we learn about Trudeau's use of the word Peoplekind. This is The Right Side, episode 55, recorded Saturday, February 10th, 2018, a show for Peoplekind. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for The Right Side once again. Patrick and myself are here, as we are each and every week. Last week, we started foreshadowing a little bit about what we were going to talk about this week, and oh boy, did that come true on many counts. Welcome back.
It's good to be back as well. Hopefully everyone's being able to cheer on our Canadian athletes at the Winter Olympics in Korea, and hopefully everyone's enjoying the start to their February. And if you got lots of news to talk about this week, don't we?
That's right. And if you are listening to this, or if you're not interested in the Olympics at all and you just prefer news, well, Right Side is a podcast that cuts through bias and sensationalism in the mainstream media, and that's what we need to do this week, because there's lots of things being talked about, but the core of the matter isn't actually what the media is talking about, and the narrative just got changed far too quickly on many of these stories. So, shall we begin?
Let's start.
All right, so we're picking up right where we left off last week on the topic of wine, except this week we're not talking about the government spending money on the purchasing of wine and other alcoholic beverages, but we're actually going to be talking about what Rachel Notley did this week to the province of BC. So last week we talked about the BC government engaging in more consultations and discussions with stakeholders along the Trans Mountain pipeline expansion route that could ultimately lead to the restriction in the amount of diluted bitumen that the pipeline can carry. And as we talked about last week, that would in effect make the project economically infeasible. Well, this week the actions in this dispute reached a new level. Alberta has banned the import of wine from BC. That's right, wine. So last year, Alberta spent $72 million on BC wine, and 95% of the wine in Canada comes from BC. So that's a pretty large margin of the wine in Canada coming from BC, and Alberta spending $72 million. That sounds like a lot, but we'll get there in just a moment. Alberta is spending this money in BC. BC is earning this money from Alberta. And that's a two-way street. That's what we call free interprovincial trade, which is what our country of Canada is built around, the confederation of the various provinces. And in practice and in theory, we're most of the time able to trade freely with these provinces, but that doesn't happen. Now, you might think $72 million is a large number. Well, that needs to be compared to the oil industry that we're actually talking about here. In 2016-2017, royalties to the Alberta government on oil sands bitumen were $1.48 billion alone. $1.48 billion coming from the bitumen oil sands going to the province of Alberta. Yeah, we still make money on conventional oil and natural gas and whatnot, but this was the bulk majority of it. And back in 2015, the oil sands were responsible for inserting almost $23 billion worth of cash and investment into the Canadian economy. So that's the level of the industry that we're talking about here when it comes to the oil sands. Now, fighting with BC on the level of wine, when you look at it this way, it just doesn't make sense. Because, immediately after the ban here went into place, the talk turned from pipelines and energy to wine. And, this was the talk in BC, it was also the talk in Alberta, and it was also the talk in other parts of the country as well. And I think it's quite clear that when the channel changes like that, you're kind of defeating the purpose of what you're trying to do. Now, this talk even went all the way out to Quebec, and having people in Quebec buy BC wine to stand in solidarity with those people in BC. So, as you can see, the topic went from energy to wine. Now, let's just talk a minute about being persuasive here. When you are trying to make a point, you need to focus on the core of the issue, and that, in this case, is energy and oil. And talking about wine, I don't think is going to do that. And here's why. When we are sanctioning the wine industry in BC, that industry does less than 10% of the revenue that we're concerned with in Alberta. And that's the problem here. When we look at it on the exact numbers here, the revenues of the BC wine industry come in at only 4.8% of the total royalty revenue that the Alberta government earned alone from the oil industry last year. 4.8%, and that's remarkably small for wine. So I don't know why we're punishing BC on this level, because, I mean, that makes sense that could be the first shot in an opening salvo, but you never know. And, this week, things also got even more bizarre on Twitter because numerous days this week, Premier Notley would quote messages of support from all over BC, whether it was, in the interior or even in Victoria. And these were messages from people in BC, apparently, that were in support of her wine ban. And they weren't tweets, so we couldn't verify that they were actually there. They were apparently calls or letters into the Premier's office of support. And like I said, when you're trying to make a point like this, talking about something completely different doesn't really make that point. This would be the equivalent of an umbrella salesperson in downtown Vancouver talking about how sunny it is outside while trying to sell umbrellas in the winter in downtown Vancouver. Which, I mean, that person would be a pretty bad salesman, right?
They would be, because it's generally not very sunny in downtown Vancouver in the winter anyways.
Right. And, I mean, you don't need an umbrella today, but here you are. You're having that discussion anyways, and that's effectively what we're doing with the wine industry. Now, looking at BC Premier John Horgan's response, he said that the government's not going to retaliate, and he's just going to continue on his merry path. And let's also realize here that the people that this wine ban is hurting, the people in the interior of BC. And I think it's well known at this point that the people of the interior of BC, at least to the people in BC, will know this, maybe not in the rest of Canada, but those people didn't vote for the NDP or Green government that you guys have right now.
That's right. Yeah, only 2 NDP seats come from outside of Vancouver Island, the Lower Mainland, and coastal BC. So there's really no skin off their back. That's all BC Liberal country in the Okanagan there.
And, when you look at this, the ultimately way we could be pushing forward on this is that BC gets the majority of its gas from Alberta and a smaller percentage of it coming from Washington State. And earlier this week, gas prices in the Lower Mainland of BC were hovering at around $1.45 per liter. Alberta could stop gas exports to BC and drive that price of gas in BC and Lower Mainland especially all the way up. And, if the BC government feels so strongly about fossil fuels and the review that they want to undertake here, let's see what the commuters of downtown Vancouver would have to say when their gas prices will skyrocket beyond their current price of $1.45 liter. Who would then be mad? I think the people in downtown Vancouver might be mad. And
I certainly would be.
Right, and you're on the island, and I imagine they are similarly high there, right?
They are. Currently, it's at $1. It's $1.36.9, I believe, right now. So it would hurt a lot of people, and a lot of people would be start to wonder about their government because the BC government says that they're trying to put forward British Columbians' interests in this, but it's not really in the interest of British Columbians to be having to pay unnecessarily high charges for their gas if Alberta does decide to go down this road.
Right. And I mean, that would be one definite way to get the talk in the media and among the population to return to that of oil, natural resources, and pipelines, and not ultimately wine, which, as I said, is 4.8% of the amount of royalties that the Alberta oil industry generates, which is minuscule when you think about it. Now, the federal government hasn't taken sides yet, but they insist that the pipeline must be built, and we talked about that last week. And we'll talk more about some fun stuff that the federal government is doing also this week on the Energy File. And, ultimately, if they wanted to, the federal government could shut down this debate by invoking Section 9210, Section C of the Constitution, and stating this project to be at the advantage of Canada. And, this has been invoked at least 422 times since 1867, but not since 1961. It was mainly for railways. So, I mean, the government of Canada could do that. Jason Kenney called for an emergency debate in the Alberta legislature, but the premier's spokeswoman said that there was little point to convening the legislature on an issue that all parties agree on. And meanwhile, also late this week, Premier Rachel Notley created a task force of Canadian experts to look at ways to further respond to BC. And this group includes former New Brunswick Premier Frank McKenna, former Deputy Prime Minister and Federal Justice Minister Anne McClellan, former Syncrude Canada President Jim Carter, and legal scholar Peter Hogg. So as you can see here, they are definitely looking at the way they could go in the future. But I think the most surefire way to retaliate in kind would be on the gas front. And the wine ban and the bizarre messages that the premier has been sending out of support has really shifted the discussion here from pipelines and energy all the way back to wine, which doesn't really go far to make the point that she's trying to make. And I think that was immediately clear as soon as this wine ban took place, because that was the talk in the media for the rest of the week. Wine.
And a lot of people, regular people in BC don't really actually care that much that the Alberta is not going to be buying BC wine. People that it's going to hurt most is actually, well, other than the Albertans that actually like BC wine and like to buy it, would be just the wine industry itself. It's not going to hurt everyday British Columbians, because it just means that our wine prices are going to go down because of the surplus, or that they're going to try and find other ways of exporting that, either to Asia or to the United States or to Europe. It's just going to go somewhere else. So that's not going to be...
Yeah, and why target the areas that voted Liberal in the last election? They, are already probably upset with the NDP government in BC, so it makes little sense whatsoever. And no one is asking that question, and no one is asking why aren't the gas shipments to BC being turned off for the island's fuel and the Lower Mainland's fuel sources. So...
Yeah, and I sure wouldn't like it myself, but it would be a certainly effective way of firing back at the so-called anti-pipeline BC government.
And purely looking at it from a stance of posturing and negotiation, by attacking the wine sector and not going after the gas and causing the gas prices to go up, that sends a message, and that's probably the message John Horgan is getting, is that Rachel Notley's not serious about it.
Mm-hmm.
So... I don't know, but I wonder if the new Liberal leader in BC, Andrew Wilkinson, has anything to say on that, because that is our BC story for the week.
That is indeed the case. So yeah, just a few hours after last week's episode we finished recording it, the BC Liberal Party actually concluded their leadership race, and that was, of course, triggered by the resignation of former Premier and Party leader Christy Clark back on August 4th last year. And boy, this was really not an easy election to predict. After many months of debate and an election that went a full 5 rounds of voting, Andrew Wilkinson was actually chosen as the new leader of the BC Liberal Party, and he edged out former Conservative MP Diane Watts by 53% to 47% on the 5th ballot. So let's talk about the candidates a bit, because many thought that Watts, who was the only woman in the race and the only candidate to not have ties to the BC Liberals, many thought that she would win, but she was considered the frontrunner during much of the campaign, yet she kind of failed to connect with voters, and poor showings at the debates and a lack of policy ended up leading to her eventual downfall on the 5th ballot. Her campaign had recruited many thousands of new members, but it actually faltered when it came to getting them out to vote. And apparently fewer than half of the Watts recruits actually turned out in the 3 days of balloting. Now, others thought that Michael Lee, who was the rookie MP from Vancouver, had a good chance. The Vancouver-based lawyer had the business community on his side, and he had a strong campaign. However, by not being in the legislature very long, because he was just elected last year, he did not really have that much name recognition compared to the other candidates. But still, he put up pretty good numbers for a rookie MP, and he finished in a respectable 3rd. Now, Vaughn Palmer of the Vancouver Sun notes that Lee's organizer in the South Asian community was Suk Dhaliwal, who was a longtime federal Liberal and no fan of Conservative Watts, and his recruits may well have been instructed to make their second choice anybody but Watts. So, and it was certainly the case that when Lee dropped off the the ballot towards the fifth end that Watts really didn't gain that much from Lee's voters. Now, former Transportation Minister Todd Stone, who we talked about before, didn't do as well as he wanted to, but this was due to news breaking out a couple days before the election that his campaign had to cancel almost 1,400 party signups after auditors found that they included fake email addresses. So that was a huge scandal. And that compounded with the recent news of ICBC's financial ruin, which, along with the transit troubles in Metro Vancouver, was partly his responsibility under his cabinet portfolio in the last 4 years. So all in all, voters didn't trust Stone with the reins of the party. But someone that was trusted even less than Stone was former Finance Minister Mike de Jong. Now, normally finance ministers have a lot of name recognition as the most important cabinet role, but in this case, it didn't actually work well for de Jong. He had a previous stellar record of posting surpluses, but that was tainted by the siphoning of money from Crown corporations such as BC Hydro and ICBC. Now, former Vancouver mayor and current Vancouver MLA Sam Sullivan also ran, but he placed in sixth and was never expecting nor really expected to do any higher than he did. But now let's talk about the winner, Andrew Wilkinson. Now, when a relative unknown is elected as leader, the media likes to make dire predictions about what type of leader they'll be or what radical agenda they might have,
The sheer smear.
or to make unfavorable comparisons to former leaders. And that's what the national media did right after federal Conservative leader Andrew Scheer's election, which I detailed in full on episode 19, which we called The Scheer Smear, as you so rightly said. Now, soon after the election, the National Post and other syndicated newspapers ran with the title, quote, "He reminds me of Gordon Campbell. Meet Andrew Wilkinson, the newly elected leader of the BC Liberals." Now, most people, when they remember Gordon Campbell, if they remember him at all, they'll either think of two things, either his 2003 drunk driving misdemeanor while on vacation in Hawaii, or his implementing of the harmonized sales tax shortly after the 2009 election when it wasn't campaigned on. The HST would also increase taxes on sectors that had previous PST exemptions, which was seen as a way to increase tax revenue, and it was soon voted down in a referendum, and Campbell's approval rating dipped so low that he ended up resigning. So while he did many good things in his 10 years as premier, like turning around the BC's economy, for instance, and boosting industry and job growth, along with lower taxes, he's mostly known for those two bad things. So a major newspaper leading with the headline, "He reminds me of Gordon Campbell," is very misleading, and it's not going to put Wilkinson in a good light for people that are trying to find out more about him.
Precisely. And that is very important when it comes to leaders. People like to make connections between them. And if you have, like you said, those two marks on Gordon Campbell, and anyone who remembers their time during the BC Liberals will remember that. And, you got to wonder if maybe that's a little bit intentional or not.
Yeah, exactly, especially when you actually look into the article itself, and we find that the expanded quote reads as, quote, "He reminds me of Gordon Campbell, but far less charming." Now, this is from David Moskrop, who is a liberal political scientist with Simon Fraser University. His bio describes himself as, quote, "currently working on a book about why we make bad political decisions and how we can make better ones." Now, despite trying to appear objectively neutral, his Twitter feed really reads like one of the cabinet ministers of Trudeau or Horgan, and why his opinion matters so much that it should be the headline on one of the country's most read newspapers, and on an article that should be describing Wilkinson to people who probably don't know that much about him, is kind of beyond me. But let's talk about Wilkinson himself, just so for people who don't know that much about him, kind of get a better introduction than the media would give. So he's kind of got the education and the experience needed to run a party. He's a trained doctor and a lawyer and a Rhodes Scholar of Oxford, and he was the BC Liberal president from 1998 to 2001, and after that he was also the deputy minister in the Campbell government. Now, he also served as president of the BC Civil Liberties Association from 93 to 95, and as mentioned before, he was in Clark's cabinet upon election in 2013 as the Minister of Technology, then the Minister of Advanced Education, and then finally the Attorney General. Now, he said that his party has a few main priorities now, one of which is to win the upcoming February 14th by-election in Kelowna West. That's right, not many people have been talking about it, but it's actually a fairly important one because it might come back to the BC Liberals. Especially after this whole wine thing that's been going on. You might have heard about it recently.
They got to be talking about that there.
That's for sure. So his plan after the by-election is to oppose the NDP's electoral referendum, which you might have heard about before as well on the show, and to build awareness as to what the NDP and Greens actually want to accomplish with a yes result on that referendum. And after that, he says he will work towards, quote, making BC the best place in the world to do business. Now, he wants to do this by streamlining regulations, lowering small business taxes, and making it easier for new businesses to register, whilst privatizing liquor and marijuana stores. So he also wants to bring BC Liberals back to their roots of free enterprise and fiscal conservatism. He said this in his victory speech, I suppose you could say. He said, quote, "We have to build on the past. We've got the heritage of having put together the values that have led to success in the past. Those are things to build upon, not to discard." So those thinking that Wilkinson will radically change the party will be disappointed, but he will likely have his own method to success that will differ from the Campbell and the Clark government. Wilkinson said Saturday that he's looking forward to debating the New Democrats in the legislature and asking questions to, quote, make their skin crawl. So it's clear that he's not going to go easy on
and he's
the
got his head in
the Greens.
And he's got his head in the right place too.
That's true, and it's not going to make it easy for them. So as with all things, we'll have to watch him closely to see how he'll do, and as with any strong, stable minority government, an election can happen at any time, so it's imperative that he's ready to be able to give voters an alternative if they want it to the NDP and the Greens.
You know, based on the profiling we've done here, he seems like a very solid choice. Seems like perhaps from an outsider's perspective, looks like the safe choice as well. And, you know, we were talking also about Diane Watts in the past, and she was, correct me if I'm wrong, leading up until the final ballot on this, and that's when it tipped over. And it wasn't a blowout either for Wilkinson. So Diane Watts did have significant support in the party, and she was just second through the entire vote, right?
That's true, but the way they were talking about it beforehand was that she was the overwhelming favorite, and it's quite clear that with the preferential ballot, as we've seen with the federal Conservatives as well, that the overwhelming favorite sometimes is not overwhelming because they need to have second choice support from other voters as well.
Definitely.
And that was something that she didn't have as much of as the other candidates. Now, something else to mention about that is that Wilkinson's not just seen as the safe choice, he's kind of seen as the back to your roots sort of choice. Like he was in the Clark government, but he wasn't seen as being so close to the Clark government as to repeat the disasters and all the scandals that had happened during the latter part of the Campbell and Clark government. So he's kind of portrayed as someone who will bring a new face to the party, but he's going to kind of bring it back to the roots, and that's going to be something else that we'll have to watch and see if he actually does that.
All right, sounds good. And I bet when this session starts up, we'll definitely be hearing from him in the BC section of the podcast here. So
that's for sure. All
right, so moving on to Canada, we have a really big Canada story this week, and this one just dropped on Thursday, and you know no one was really expecting it, and the press releases came out, and the media availabilities happened after the fact. But basically what happened is on Thursday, Environment Minister Catherine McKenna released a statement that the National Energy Board would be dismantled. And, you know, many people in the past have called for the end of the National Energy Board and to, you know, vastly streamline the process for approving new projects and whatnot. And, you know, that's what the government says they're going to do with this. But let's just talk a little bit about it first to get all the details in place before we can make that judgment or not. So its new body will be called the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, and this will be created through Bill C-69, which is a 340-page bill that must be passed through Parliament. 340 pages to dismantle the National Energy Board and replace it with the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada. Now, the selling point on this, to those who might be skeptical, is that it should be one project, one assessment. Now, with that, the idea is to have everyone involved. All aspects of the project, from economic to environment to social to indigenous, all of that will be examined with the project. And, that's the question here, is that are our current projects being unneedlessly slowed down by interests that are outside the scope of energy? And I think the idea behind this, or at least what the government is hoping, is that all of these questions will be brought forward before approval as to not cause problems going forward. Now, basically what this means is that if a new review is going to be carried out with this, and to be successful, the hope is that there will be less interference later on in the project. Does this remind you of anything?
Sure does.
It definitely reminds us of two things here, and that's the now stopped Energy East pipeline that was heading out east, and of course what we talked about in the Alberta story this week and last week regarding Trans Mountain heading down to Burnaby. Now, also with this, the government wants to give industry that when a decision is made, that they will have an absolute assurance that the project will indeed go ahead. And, there's also other stuff in this bill that make it interesting for one reason or another. The Government of Canada will have an override, so that means either Cabinet or the Ministry of Environment or the Ministry of Natural Resources will ultimately have an override to make a project go ahead or stop it, despite what the review says. And that seemed a little bit odd because, you remember during the previous Harper Conservative government, lots of people said that Northern Gateway didn't get a fair review and the government was stepping into it. Well, this new process will effectively allow that to happen. The government also says that existing projects that are currently under review or have been reviewed will be unaffected by this new framework. And the idea behind it is to ultimately streamline it. Catherine McKenna said with this that the legislation we are introducing today aims to restore public trust in how the federal government approves major projects like mines, pipelines, and hydro dams. These better rules are designed to protect our environment while improving investor confidence. They will also make Canadian energy and resource sectors more competitive. And that's what Catherine McKenna said on this. And ultimately, what the government hopes to do with this is to reduce the maximum timeline for review from 720 days down to 600 days. And with this, I guess, that's 120 days. That's what, about 4 months, I think. And, that's a good amount, but we'll have to wait and see if that actually happens, because there's also going to be an expert panel in question here, and they will be able to determine what kind of projects are to be included in this. Right now, this panel wants to include in situ oil sands projects, so that's anything in Alberta, and also the fracking industry as well, which is hydraulic fracturing to remove oil. So they want those kind of projects to be in place as well. But along with this, the federal government this week suggested that if a province has a hard cap on emissions, like Alberta does, in situ projects, i.e. the oil sands, could potentially be exempt from this lengthy approval process. So there's still lots of questions if that'll actually happen or if they'll still need to go through that route. But this is why we're still at the very beginning and why everyone, who is concerned about the energy industry in Canada should be paying close attention this week. And the exact list of projects that will fall under this regime are unknown right now. So, Catherine McKenna did say mines, pipelines, and hydro dams. But the question is, what if that whitelist on provinces and jurisdictions that have a hard cap on emissions like Alberta, and what if they start saying every new oil sands project in Alberta needs to be reviewed by this agency? That's definitely going to add a lot of red tape to the energy sector in Alberta. And that's effectively what happened with the National Energy Program in the former Trudeau government in the 1970s and early 80s. So lots of people are very concerned about this in Alberta. Now, with that, there's also the unknown list of projects, but there's also an unknown list of stakeholders that can be consulted at any point during the review stage as well. So we have unknown projects, we have unknown stakeholders, we have unknown conditions, And with this, it's kind of hard to believe that the time taken for any review of this will actually decrease when you are putting this into legislation with a 340-page bill. So let's ask ourselves, when was the last time the government introduced a 340-page piece of legislation that actually decreases regulation or attempts to streamline it and has been successful? The answer is not really.
That seems like a lot of words to try and narrow something down, doesn't it?
Yeah, 340 pages.
Especially, I mean, that's the full-length novel.
Right, and that's what it is right now. And the list of projects, the list of stakeholders, the list of conditions, all of those are currently unknown.
Mm-hmm. And not only this, but I think probably people that wouldn't know that much about this issue is, why wouldn't they just try and streamline the National Energy Board and make it so that they can approve things easier rather than creating a whole new agency out of this? Because you have to think that if they switch an entire agency around, that a lot of the staffing issues are going to change as well, and there's going to be a lot of payouts and firings from this, right?
Yeah,
you'd have to think.
Oh, definitely.
And that's going to increase a lot of costs. And then there would be the story that we covered months ago, where the federal government wanted to move the NEB from Calgary to Ottawa.
Oh, they say this is going to stay in Calgary, but as I said, lots of unknowns. Who knows if that's going to be the case?
Exactly. So there's a lot of questions here, and I think we'll have to keep looking at it.
Right. And, while we have Rachel Notley and John Horgan going at it, we have this happening federally, and this wasn't talked about at all. And I think a reason that wasn't talked about was I don't know where the media was this week. They also definitely weren't on our firing line as well. So let's talk about that now.
Yeah, that's for sure. The reason that they might not have been talking about energy is because of another story that came out. And as we mentioned on last week's episode, Trudeau is completing his town hall tour with stops in Edmonton and Nanaimo. And at that time, honestly, I doubt that we would have thought that any of it would be newsworthy at all beforehand. But then a story came out of the Edmonton town hall that kind of reverberated around the world, was made into a meme on the internet, and was broadcast on international media in the UK, the US, and other locales. So partly through a woman's 4-minute-long rambling question at the Edmonton Town Hall, a substantial portion of which was consisting of her proselytizing for her church, to the growing annoyance of the audience, Trudeau interrupted her to teach us all a word that didn't get much use until now. So have a listen to this.
So that's why we came here today to ask you to also look into the policies that religious charitable organizations have in our legislation so that it can also be changed, because maternal love is the love that's going to change the future of mankind. So we'd like you to look into
we
that.
would like to say peoplekind, not necessarily mankind, because it's more inclusive.
There we go, exactly. Yes, thank you.
We can all learn from each other. Okay.
Yeah, so that's right. Peoplekind. It's something that kind of grew slowly on Twitter as more and more people talked about it. A lot of videos popped up on YouTube about it. And then as other media sources picked up on it, it quickly became a viral sensation viewed around the world. Well, other than the CBC, of course, their only stories were that the U.S. far-right seizes on Peoplekind comment ahead of NAFTA talks, which is some pretty serious title editorializing. And they also came out with an article with a linguist saying that he's apparently not the first people in Peoplekind. Oh, sorry, first person to ever use the word. So I jest, of course, but it's kind of hard not to treat it as a joke until you start thinking about the ramifications of such a joke. Now, Trudeau's brushed off the story, saying to reporters outside of the House of Commons that, quote, "You all know that I don't necessarily have the best track record on jokes. I made a dumb joke a few days ago that seems to have gone a little viral. It played well in the room and in context. Out of context, it doesn't play so well. It's a little reminder to me that I shouldn't be making jokes even when I think they're funny." Truly words of wisdom for us all. Now, Trudeau has a history of making weird off-the-cuff jokes that land poorly, most infamously at a conference in October 2014, about a year before he became Prime Minister. He made a very cringe-worthy joke when asked a serious question about whether he would continue the combat mission in Iraq. He said, quote, "Why aren't we talking more about the kind of humanitarian aid that Canada can and must be engaged in, rather than, trying to whip out our CF-18s and show them how big they are? It just doesn't work like that in Canada." Now, the phrase "whip out our CF-18s" kind of dogged Trudeau for months afterwards, as he was accused of being a politician who can't be taken seriously on the world stage. And I think as we've seen him in the last few years of being a prime minister, he definitely isn't really taken that seriously on the world stage, because he, pulls up his pants to let everyone look at his socks, for instance.
Let's just look at the state of NAFTA negotiations, too.
Yeah, and there's just a few other things that have happened out there in the real world that have really shown that Trudeau isn't taken seriously at all on the world stage. Now, not everyone has treated this Peoplekind controversy as just a bad joke. Trudeau was subject to mockery for his awkward demeanor, as well as accusations of virtue signaling by trying to change the gender-neutral mankind to peoplekind, and he was also accused of mansplaining, which is where a man explains something to a woman in a manner regarded as condescending or patronizing. Now, NDP leader Jagmeet Singh was one to call Trudeau out on his mansplaining, and the Conservatives also gotten a few jabs, with Lisa Raitt urging the Prime Minister to person up during an exchange in the House of Commons. Now, in the international media, Piers Morgan was especially scathing of the Prime Minister, calling him a, quote, "spineless, virtue-signaling excuse for a feminist." And tongue-in-cheek, he later said that, quote, "when Neil Armstrong, the first people on the moon, he said it was a one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind, and he could have had no idea how offensive he was being at the time." Now, others mentioned that in Trudeau's world, a gentleman by the name of Guy Manson would be called person. And this also reverberated into the United States a lot as well. The program Fox and Friends had Dr. Jordan Peterson on for an interview, and he said of the gaffe, he said, quote, "It's quite the performance. I'm afraid our Prime Minister is only capable of running his ideas on a few very narrow ideological tracks." Now, mankind has been a term used for centuries. It's derived from the Saxon word man, and that's with two N's. And that was used to refer to humans in general. And mankind is used quite frequently in literature, and is usually used interchangeably with humankind, which is another well-accepted term if you truly want to be gender neutral. But peoplekind, no one before this had really ever said it that much at all. So why Trudeau choose to go with that word instead of the significantly more natural options might be the real mystery here. Now, many mainstream outlets also covered the gaffe, as we mentioned before, such as CNN, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the BBC, the Guardian, and many different others. However, Gerald Butts, who is Trudeau's chief PMO advisor, he took to Twitter a few days after the incident to say that, quote, "the lesson to take from this joke being torqued by InfoWars and other alt-right Nazi friends of the rebel is that they're paying attention. Game on, #Team Trudeau." So, first of all, calling other media organizations Nazis is an insult to those who suffered persecution from actual Nazis, such as the Jewish people in the Holocaust. The people that the Trudeau government actually somehow left off the Holocaust Memorial.
Which we had to go to the BBC to get a story on, just a reminder.
Exactly. So, second of all, this also wasn't just covered by the so-called alt-right friends of the rebel, whoever those might be. This was pretty much covered by every media organization around the world, except for the CBC, of course. And third of all, as Ezra Levant said, quote, "It's not odd that the Rebel, a Canadian media outlet, is paying attention to the country's prime minister. What we really learned is from Butts' tweet is actually the reverse, that Trudeau's office, and Butts in particular, is paying attention to little old us and other online critics." So at the end of all this, it's clear that as well as being just a really bad joke, Trudeau actually believes that we should actually use peoplekind instead of mankind, and that should worry all peoplekind everywhere.
And the reason why we can say this, and the reason why we can say it's not just a joke, is that if it was a joke, why did it take so long to respond to this?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it took a lot of time afterwards for him to actually, kind of apologize for it and try and brush it off. It took like a good 3 to 4 days afterwards, which, as we know in the political terms, that's a week is almost a year, right?
Even more so on the internet. You wouldn't believe how far this reverberated. People who don't normally pay attention to Canada were seeing this. And, this once again is putting Canada on the map for all the wrong reasons. And, yes, we could brush it off as a joke, but I don't think so in this case. And I mean, it just felt so genuine, I'm going to say, when he said it.
It did kind of seem genuine. Now, when he was talking, it's almost like he wanted to cut off the person who was kind of rambling on about her question, but to do it in such a way was very curious as to why he actually went with that. Like, I think we can all say that we've had really bad jokes being said at awkward times, but Trudeau's the world leader of Canada, and he's should have experience in the media and should have experience in public speaking enough to know that this probably wasn't that good of a thing to say. And it's, as you said, it's putting Canada on the map, and it's getting a lot of people looking at Canada at a time where there's a lot of interest in what's going on internationally, as well as I said before, the Olympics going on. So a lot of people are going to be looking at Canada, and they'll look at them and say, "Oh yeah, wasn't their leader the one that said peoplekind?" They'll start. And it's almost like making Canada a mockery on the international stage, and that's not going to help us, especially when it comes to things like NAFTA.
Bingo, and that's what it has to come back to. Until that deal is secured, until the future of NAFTA is secured, we need to be professional, and we need to be worldly when we're dealing with other countries, not just the US, but all of the other countries. We need to be worldly and show that we are a professional partner in this trade agreement. And it just doesn't really seem all that professional to say peoplekind. So
that's true. And really, you can definitely say mankind, which I think brings us nicely to Word of the Week, which, of course, is mankind. Now, this is defined as human beings considered collectively, as in the entire human race. And the quote used here is, quote, research for the benefit of all mankind. And I think that really sums up what's going on here, is people are starting to change words and change the meanings of words to gender-neutral alternatives, shall we say. But there's also a case where political correctness can go too far, especially when such a thing like mankind is already gender-neutral. As I said before, it's being used to describe the entire human race, and it's a perfectly acceptable word to use. So just to change that to something that someone doesn't really say very much before, like peoplekind, it's really truly baffling.
Indeed it is. And I mean, I'm trying to wonder out there if there's anyone who actually thinks that the word mankind is offensive.
There's always one. There's always at least one person who thinks like that. There's a saying where if you have to ask, am I the only one that thinks blah, usually you're not the only one. So I'm sure if there's at least one person, there's also another person that thinks of this too. Especially considering that clearly Trudeau thinks mankind is offensive because he wants to use peoplekind because it's apparently more inclusive. But he just found out how inclusive that meant because he included the whole world in that joke. And that's our firing line for this week.
Aye. All right, and that also ties off this episode of The Right Side nicely. Thank you for listening, everyone, and being here with us. If you want full show notes for this episode, which you probably do, all the peoplekind out there, you can find that at rightsidenews.ca. We're also on iTunes and YouTube at rightsidenews.ca/iTunes. and rightsidenews.ca/YouTube. We also post stories in the week to social media, stories that we don't talk about on the show, stories we consider for the show, and the actual stories that we have on the show on Twitter and Facebook. And we're on Twitter and Facebook at RightSideCA. And that's it for this week. We'll see you next week for another episode of The Right Side.
And to all the Peoplekind out there, we will continue to give you the news that will put you on the right side of the news, to give you the context that you need, and to make sure that we cut out all that bias and sensationalism that the media tries to shove into your stories. So with that, we'll see you next week for another episode of The Right Side.